The Loch Ness Monster is one of the most enduring mysteries in the field of cryptozoology. This phenomenon has been an integral part of the lore surrounding this deep and vast Scottish loch ever since reports of a mysterious creature became international news in the 1930s, and numerous explanations for the sightings of this monster have been offered over the years. One of the most widely known attempts to explain the aquatic enigma is the suggestion that the Loch Ness Monster represents a living plesiosaur, a lineage of marine reptiles that went extinct 66 million years ago, during the same mass extinction event that wiped out all the non-bird dinosaurs. Such a late survival of a group of large-bodied, air-breathing animals would require some pretty extraordinary circumstances, and the likelihood of them surviving today in this one restricted body of water is extremely improbable, to say the least. But this plesiosaur idea has nevertheless been much popularized in the media. Unfortunately for advocates of Nessie's plesiosaur identity, numerous searches of the loch have taken place over the decades, using all sorts of technologies such as cameras, hydrophones, sonar, thermal imaging drones, and even underwater robots. But no sign of a long-necked aquatic reptile has been spotted. In fact, a survey of environmental DNA in the loch has also been undertaken. This eDNA is traces of DNA present in the loch's waters that come from organisms inhabiting the freshwater body. By analysing the DNA content of the water samples, scientists have been able to build up a picture of all that lives in Loch Ness and contributes their DNA to the environment, whether by shedding skin cells, defecating in it, or dying in it. And were there any signs of plesiosaurs? No. No reptile DNA of any sort was detected in the loch, although a significant amount of eel DNA was found, with scientists suggesting that many Loch Ness Monster sightings could perhaps be attributed to people seeing large eels in the water. Still, the intrigue surrounding Loch Ness and its monstrous inhabitant continues, even if it is probably just eels. But the eels of truth are not going to stop me from exploring the speculative evolution of the Loch Ness Monster, because making up an evolutionary history for a hypothetical animal is just too much fun. So join me as we discuss how a living freshwater plesiosaur that inhabits Loch Ness might have survived for 66 million years without leaving a trace in the fossil record. Quickly before we start, I'm very excited to announce that we now have a revamped merch store, and as a special tie-in to this video, we've created this Loch Ness Monster themed design. It features this wonderful illustration of the cryptid as a living plesiosaur according to our modern understanding of what plesiosaurs looked like, and shows the hypothetical classification scheme of this speculative animal. You can get the design on a t-shirt, other clothes, as well as a poster, but yeah, it's probably just eels. Anyway, to start us off, let's have a look at real prehistoric plesiosaur evolution to get an idea of which group the monster could have evolved from. The plesiosaurs were a hugely successful and diverse group of marine reptiles, inhabiting all sorts of aquatic environments. They first appear in the fossil record in rocks dating to just over 200 million years ago, towards the end of the Triassic period. They exploded in diversity in the early Jurassic period, with these earliest forms mostly having relatively small heads atop long necks that were attached to very rigid bodies, and 4 paddle-like limbs to propel themselves through the water. Now, a word of warning for anyone interested in going down the rabbit hole of plesiosaur evolution. It can get pretty confusing. Evolution is a wonderfully messy business, and over the course of research on these reptiles, which first began back in the 1820s, a lot of different ideas have been thrown about with regards to how we should classify them. The current, most widely accepted overview of their evolutionary relationships is as follows. The entire group is known by the name Plesiosauria, and they are related to a few other lineages of Triassic period oddities, such as some turtley looking reptiles that are not actually turtles, a group that kinda looks like plesiosaurs but with legs, and possibly whatever the hell this thing is. Within Plesiosauria, we have 3 major groupings. First is the superfamily Plesiosauroidea. This lineage contains the most species, and includes most of the classic long-necked, short-headed members. They were around by the start of the Jurassic period and survived until the very end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. 6 different families are classified within the Plesiosauroids. We have Plesiosauridae itself, plus the long-necked microclidids, cryptoclidids, and elasmosaurids. But in addition to these, there are also a couple of families that evolved from long-necked ancestors to have shorter necks. These are the leptoclidids and the polycotylids. The second major grouping is called Pliosauridae, which includes species with short necks and large skulls, such as the infamous Liplorodon. However, it becomes a bit more confusing here, as Plesiosaurids originally began as long-necked, small-headed creatures. Therefore, Plesiosauridae also encompasses some Triassic to early Jurassic species that resemble Plesiosauroids quite closely. Later in the Jurassic period, the Plesiosaurids then gave rise to giant-headed, short-necked species that came to dominate the aquatic food chains of the world's oceans. These reptiles, which were essentially massive mouths propelled by a streamlined body, served as the apex predators of the later Jurassic and early Cretaceous seas until they became extinct early in the late Cretaceous, not quite making it to the mass extinction 66 million years ago. Finally, the third major lineage is called Romaleosauridae, the problem child of the plesiosaurs. They existed during the early to mid-Jurassic, and have often been classified as close relatives of the Plesiosaurids, owing to the large body size and robust-looking skull of the species Romaleosaurus. However, Romaleosaurids were a diverse group, with some species exhibiting neck and skull proportions very much like certain Plesiosauroids, and they also lack many anatomical details that are shared between the Plesiosaurids and the Plesiosauroids. Consequently, it appears they may represent their own distinct lineage, likely branching off from the rest of the plesiosaur evolutionary tree at a very early stage. Interestingly, it appears that the Romaleosaurs were the first to emerge as the top predators among plesiosaurians. During the early Jurassic, Plesiosauroids were relatively small, characterized by long necks and elongated snouts that were suited for pursuing smaller prey. In contrast, Romaleosaurs were noticeably larger and more robust for their time, clearly adapted to a macro-predatory lifestyle, feeding on larger fish and potentially even other marine reptiles. It was only after the Romaleosaurs disappeared during the Middle Jurassic that the Plesiosaurids took things a step further, and the classic huge-jawed, short-necked megapredators appeared. In terms of anatomy, there is truly nothing like a plesiosaur alive today, nor did anything resembling them ever evolve again after their extinction. The plesiosaurian mode of locomotion, utilizing 4 flipper-like limbs to propel themselves, is a unique way to get about underwater. Although modern sea turtles do have 4 flippers as well, they only really use the front ones for propulsion. So how exactly did the plesiosaurs swim? The limbs of the plesiosaur were powered by strong muscles anchored to their large pectoral and pelvic girdles, with both the fore and hind limbs being nearly the same length and shape. Analyses of plesiosaur swimming actions and the timings of downstrokes using robotic paddles suggest that the similar anatomy of the limbs actually enabled the back flippers to exploit vortices imparted to the water by the fore flippers when their strokes were timed right, thereby increasing the efficiency with which these animals swam. The exact timings between flipper strokes would have varied depending on the speed at which the animal was moving, allowing these reptiles a highly adjustable locomotion method that saved them a lot of energy. Plesiosaurs as a whole also have an intriguing abdominal anatomy. The large, flat pectoral and pelvic girdles I mentioned, which provided ample area for attaching the powerful muscles used to drive the limbs, were positioned at either end of numerous belly ribs that formed robust baskets of bone on their undersides. The belly ribs, known as gastralia, likely functioned along with the girdles to provide support and protection to the lower sides of these animals, while also contributing to the reptile's notably wide-bodied appearance. The anatomy of the gastral basket and girdles, plus the fact that the hips and shoulders are only weakly connected to the spine, also rules out the possibility that any of the known plesiosaurs were amphibious or could support themselves on land, showing that the reptiles spent their entire lives in the water. Now that we've briefly examined the fascinating complexity of plesiosaur evolution and looked at some of the general anatomy of these reptiles, let's focus back in on the Plesiosauroids. These are the animals people will generally be imagining when they think of the Loch Ness Monster, even though it's probably just eels. As I mentioned, there are 6 families included within Plesiosauroidea. One of the first to appear was Plesiosauridae, which contains the namesake of the entire group, Plesiosaurus itself. These were relatively small to medium-sized animals, reaching a maximum length of some 4.5 meters, nearly 15 feet, and they only existed during the early to middle Jurassic. Plesiosaurids appear to have lived as generalist predators, using their long necks to get their heads up close to schools of small fish, cephalopods, and whatever else was swimming in the water around them. These early Plesiosauroids are only known from rocks deposited in relatively shallow waters near the continents, so they seem to have started out as quite nearshore marine reptiles. Another closely related family of early Jurassic Plesiosauroids was Microcleididae. These were also quite small plesiosaurs compared to those that lived later, though one species of Microclidus reaches about 5 meters in total length, or over 16 feet. These reptiles, like the members of Plesiosauridae, are mainly known from Western Europe and have primarily been found in shallow nearshore marine deposits. Interestingly, Microclidus itself appears to have developed some specialized feeding adaptations based on the structure of its reinforced skull and relatively robust interlocking teeth, accompanied by a peculiar tiny pair of front teeth on the upper jaw, though the precise details of its feeding behavior are not definitively understood yet. The Plesiosauroid family Cryptoclididae dominated the later Jurassic seas and also survived into the early Cretaceous, becoming a diverse grouping with many members known worldwide. Some of them could grow quite large, reaching up to 8 meters (26 feet) in length, and they exhibited a fascinating array of lifestyles. While species such as Cryptoclidus, which you may remember from Walking with Dinosaurs, was likely a fairly generalized hunter targeting small soft-bodied prey, there were also some specialized deep-diving Cryptoclidids, as well as a perplexing flat-bodied short-necked species that appears to have been adapted to maintaining stability in turbulent choppy surface waters in shallow regions. One of the best known families of Plesiosauroids is Elasmosauridae, a lineage currently only known from the Cretaceous that appeared some 130 million years ago and was the only Plesiosauroid family to survive until the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago. This family includes the ridiculously long-necked and truly huge species, such as Albertonectes from Canada at about 12 meters, nearly 40 feet in length. 7 of those meters are made up by the elasmosaur's neck alone, which contained a staggering 76 individual neck bones, the most of any known animal. Many elasmosaurids similarly had some rather extreme necks, and despite the impression that these reptiles had proportionally small skulls, when you look at them by themselves, it's clear that many elasmosaurids were formidable predators in their own right, possessing sizable heads and jaws clearly adapted for biting down hard. Many elasmosaurids would not just have been eating small fish, but would also have preyed on larger animals and potentially other marine reptiles as well. Their skulls were also pretty diverse in shape, with different species suited to consume various animals. So don't underestimate the elasmosaurs. Considering that elasmosaurids were so long-lived and globally distributed, it's no surprise that not all these reptiles shared similar body proportions, with some members lacking the extreme necks that make the group so famous. This includes the intriguing subfamily known as Aristonectinae. Aristonectines existed right towards the end of the Cretaceous and inhabited the far south of the planet, with fossils found in South America, New Zealand, and even Antarctica. These plesiosaurs had very thick necks compared to other elasmosaurs, and very wide, gaping jaws lined with rows of fine, densely packed teeth. The Aristonectines seem to have been a group of possibly sediment-sieving plesiosaurs, scooping up mud from the sea floor and trapping small animals between their closely spaced teeth. These animals were also big, potentially growing to 12 meters in length. Truly a spectacular lineage of elasmosaurs. And then we come to the short-necked Plesiosauroids, the ones that convergently evolved more pliosaur-like body proportions. One of these families is called Leptoclididae, a group that lived in the early Cretaceous in Europe, Africa, North America, and Australia. The Leptoclidids were sort of like Romaleosauridae round 2, possessing relatively short necks and proportionally large skulls, but not to the same extent as the derived pliosaurs. In fact, some researchers have suggested that they might be late surviving Romaleosaurs, but our current understanding is that they are instead related to the elasmosaurids, and therefore evolved from longer-necked ancestors. The Leptoclidids were relatively small to mid-sized Plesiosauroids, and were likely primarily pursuing small prey items such as fish. And interestingly, they've mostly been found in rocks that represent freshwater and brackish habitats. Some of these deposits are from ancient rivers, but some are also lake environments. So we have plesiosaurs in lakes. Suddenly, the idea of the Loch Ness Monster being a surviving plesiosaur is seeming a whole lot more plausible. Okay, well, not really. It's still probably just eels, but bear with me here. The other family of shorter-necked Plesiosauroids is Polycotylidae, which contains yet more non-marine species. The polycotylids are an incredible group, showcasing a variety of body plans and modes of life. They existed from the early to the late Cretaceous, surviving into the final stage of the Cretaceous, but seemingly dying out just before the asteroid-induced mass extinction that closed out the period. Many polycotylids appeared unlike any other plesiosaurian lineage, evolving into small, very long-snouted species with shortened necks, while others again had a go at evolving to look much like pliosaurs. In fact, Plesiopleurodon from Wyoming was at first thought to be a pliosaur due to its 28-inch long skull, which resembled that of Lipleurodon, featuring large teeth adapted for tackling substantial prey. But it's a polycotylid. There were species such as Polycotylus itself, which was probably a very agile swimmer and fed on medium-sized fishy prey, and others such as Trinacromerum with much more delicate-looking jaws that likely pursued very fast-moving small creatures in the water. Polycotylids are found all over the world, and though they are mainly marine and open ocean species, some have also been discovered in rivers and estuaries. So far, I've only mentioned the freshwater habits of the leptocleidids and polycotylids, but remarkably, tendencies towards freshwater seem to be rather widespread among these aquatic reptiles. Elasmosaurids, some Romaleosaurids, and even very rarely pliosaurs have been discovered in non-marine sediments, suggesting that there were multiple independent radiations of these reptiles into brackish or freshwater habitats. Elasmosaurids in the late Cretaceous seem to have adapted to non-marine environments on a few different occasions, most notably with the species Fluvionectes, found in 75-million-year-old sediments in Alberta. These sediments were laid down in an estuary and river environment, indicating that this long-necked elasmosaur at least intermittently swam up river systems. The Romaleosaurs and pliosaurs similarly appear to have invaded freshwater systems, with Bichanopliosaurus found in a subtropical freshwater environment in the Jurassic rocks of China, and a couple of unnamed Cretaceous pliosaurids, one from Australia and one from Germany, also turning up in river and brackish deposits. So it seems that multiple lineages of plesiosaurs frequently went from living in marine environments and started inhabiting rivers or brackish waters. This isn't entirely a surprise, considering that we have freshwater cetaceans today, the river dolphins, which evolved from oceanic dolphins. But it is exciting to learn that plesiosaurs underwent such a habitat transition too, seemingly on many occasions. In 2022, the publication of a particular freshwater plesiosaur discovery made in Morocco spurred some interesting headlines, and was also the inspiration for this video. A team of paleontologists, including my soon-to-be PhD supervisors Drs. Roy Smith and Dave Martill, discovered leptocleidid plesiosaur teeth, vertebrae, and a humerus from the riverine environment of the Chemchem group. The Chemchem is the same paleoenvironment that Spinosaurus inhabited, and so they revealed that there were freshwater-tolerating plesiosaurs coexisting with the great problem child of paleontology. What a fantastic find! And, of course, this prompted quite a few news outlets to state that the Loch Ness Monster was therefore plausible, as plesiosaurs really could live in freshwater lochs. So, just for fun, let's ignore all the mountains of evidence that prove why the monster doesn't really exist, and assume the Loch Ness Monster really is a living plesiosaur. Let's speculate about how this organism might have evolved, and have a look at past ideas about this cryptid's evolution. Firstly, I'm going to suggest that the Loch Ness Monster is a member of Elasmosauridae, since these are the classically long-necked, relatively small-headed plesiosaurs that appear to be most consistent with the general perception of the cryptid, rather than the more unusual proportions of some leptocleidids or polycotylids. Additionally, we know that elasmosaurids could inhabit freshwater ecosystems, so there are no restrictions there. Another point in favour of an elasmosaurid identity rather than a leptocleidid is the fact that leptocleidids have so far only been found in early Cretaceous rocks, so they seemingly didn't make it to the late Cretaceous, making them a less likely candidate to have survived until the modern day. Although if we are contending that plesiosaurs lived a further 66 million years after the end of the Cretaceous without leaving a fossil record anyway, then it's not like a few extra tens of millions of years makes much difference. Still, I'm favouring the Loch Ness Monster as an elasmosaurid. More specifically, within the Elasmosauridae family, I'm going to create a new subfamily to contain the Loch Ness Monster, because who's going to stop me? After a further 66 million years of evolution, this is going to be a pretty derived elasmosaurid, so a novel subfamily seems like a reasonable choice to classify it under. I'll name the subfamily Nessiterinae, a lineage that potentially split off from the Aristonectines during the Cretaceous. But I won't have to create a genus and species name for our speculative Loch Ness Elasmosaurid, because that's already been done for me. In December 1975, British naturalist Sir Peter Scott, one of the founders of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, along with American lawyer and inventor Robert Rines, published a paper in the prestigious journal Nature, officially naming the Loch Ness Monster. No, it was not a joke. They called it Nessiteras rhombopteryx, meaning the Ness inhabitant with a diamond-shaped fin. So, of course, that's the binomial we'll be using here, and that's what I've based the name of the subfamily on. One of the main issues with reconciling the Loch Ness Monster's supposed anatomy with what we now understand about plesiosaur biomechanics concerns the iconic raised-up swan-like neck pose associated with this cryptid. Because of the way the neck bones of plesiosaurs would have articulated with each other, and accounting for soft tissues such as muscles, there's simply no way that these animals would have been capable of raising their heads out of the water in this fashion. But fear not, because technically we don't actually need our speculative Nessiteras rhombopteryx to be able to do this. The most famous image of the Loch Ness Monster showing its neck raised in this position, the so-called surgeon's photograph taken in 1934, has pretty conclusively been proven to be a hoax. Similarly, another well-known Nessie photo, the so-called Loch Ness Muppet photo of 1977, is also clearly a fake. I mean, just look at the goofy grin on that thing. Most other claimed photos or videos of the cryptid are actually of objects that don't have necks raised out of the water. And so really, we can argue that our Nessiteras was fairly standard among plesiosaurs when it came to its neck movements. Since those photos that supposedly show the creature raising its head are definitive fakes, there's no reason to speculate about the cryptid having to evolve exceptional biomechanical capabilities. One of the first eyewitness accounts to truly spark public interest in the monster, the 1933 Spicer account, also describes how a man, George Spicer, and his wife witnessed something moving across the road in front of their car, as in on land, not in the water. As we've already established, the anatomy and biomechanics of the plesiosaur body plan completely rule out any possibility of locomotion on land, despite what Walking with Dinosaurs portrayed. The Spicer account was very likely a fictional one, or at least heavily embellished, and was obviously extremely inspired by the portrayal of the sauropod in the 1933 King Kong film. The way the sauropod emerges from the water and moves onto the land in precisely the same way as described in the account is incredibly suspicious, as is the fact that George Spicer, while discussing the sighting at a later date, stated that the creature he saw very much resembled the dinosaur in King Kong. So seems like Spicer had probably seen the film and then been inspired when he witnessed something, likely a herd of deer bounding across the road near the loch in the dark. Since terrestrial locomotion contradicts everything we now know about plesiosaur biology, I reckon we can probably disregard this account when considering the anatomy of our Nessiteras. Otherwise, we're dealing with an amphibious plesiosaur, presumably with a drastically rearranged pectoral and pelvic girdle to allow such support on land. Also, if it were amphibious, then that would surely mean that many more sightings in the surrounding landscape of the loch would have been made. No, I think our Nessiteras is an obligate aquatic animal, and is much more elusive because of this. And yeah, I know I'm being quite selective when it comes to which pieces of evidence to consider, but basically I'm going through and thinking which ones are too extreme to really try and work plesiosaur anatomy around. Something else we have to contend with is the fact that Loch Ness is a geologically quite recent lake, forming around 10,000 years ago after the last glacial period of the Ice Age ended. It was excavated by glacial erosion as the ice carved out the weakened rock along the Great Glen Fault. However, it is still connected to the sea at its northeast end. So our hypothetical monster must be an example of another independent and very recent reinvasion of fresh waters from a late surviving saltwater plesiosaur. Hey, they clearly travelled into freshwater multiple times throughout their real evolution, so why not one more time in our speculative evolution? Now, it has been argued that a plesiosaur couldn't possibly live in Loch Ness because the waters here are too cold, and it's too far north. However, we've actually got direct fossil evidence that contradicts claims that plesiosaurs couldn't live in cold waters, such as the potentially filter-feeding Aristonectine elasmosaurid Mortonaria that lived in the waters around what is today Antarctica, and the giant-eyed cryptoclydid Ophthalmothule, which inhabited Arctic waters. plesiosaurs appear to have been poikilothermic endotherms, meaning their body temperatures varied somewhat according to environmental conditions, but not to the same extremes as ectothermic animals. Plesiosaurs may have generated body heat while moving their limbs, and this heat would have been retained in their bodies thanks to their large sizes, therefore allowing them to inhabit higher latitude seas. So there's no reason they couldn't live in Loch Ness, apart from, all the other reasons. Another issue with the population of living plesiosaurs inhabiting the loch is the structure of the food web present here. It has been argued that there simply aren't enough stages in the food web of Loch Ness to support a large-bodied endothermic reptile that feeds entirely within this body of water. Unless, of course, they were eating all the eels. We do also now know that some Aristonectines were likely filter feeders, or at least sediment sifters, so perhaps Nessiteras feeds like this too. Anyway, in a very sarcastic publication from 1972, a couple of lake scientists decided to calculate what the population density of monsters in the loch could reasonably be. They estimated that, based on the calculated standing fish stock in Loch Ness, between 10 and 20 individual monsters could potentially be sustained within the body of water, assuming these are large creatures about 8 meters long and weighing up to 1,500 kilograms. Although this study was done in a very joking manner, it raises an important point. That's a very, very small population size, and so our Nessiteras is presumably critically endangered, and quite possibly now functionally extinct, with such limited genetic diversity remaining. What a sad thought. The last of the great plesiosaur lineage, slowly dying out in a Scottish lake. The conservation of the Loch Ness Monster was apparently the motivation for that 1975 Nature paper, as they sought to give it a proper scientific name so protective measures could be put in place, and seemingly also as a way to promote the monster as a flagship species for British wildlife conservation. So commendable motivation, to be fair. Anyway, all this is to say that, in my speculative vision for Nessiteras rhombopteryx, this animal is a highly derived freshwater invading elasmosaur that, a few thousand years ago, was a coastal marine species, until a small population found its way into the loch after the last glacial stage. The appearance of the species is relatively standard for an elasmosaur, with the classic elongated neck, 4 flippers suited to aquatic locomotion only, and a stout body, conforming to our modern understanding of plesiosaur life appearance, rather than the more outdated views of the monster as a semi-aquatic, swan neck posing plesiosaur with humps along its back. This is a very endangered species too, with only a dozen or so individuals remaining in the loch. This is of course not the first time that someone has speculated about the evolutionary history of the Loch Ness Monster. Far from it, in fact. In the 1970s, a team deployed a submersible in the loch, equipped with sonar equipment, cameras, and strobe lights to attempt to take photos of the monster. The result of this expedition was the acquisition of a series of photos set to show the paddles of the monster, which are argued to be consistent with the interpretation of the creature as a living plesiosaur. These paddles were diamond-shaped, with a distinct vein running down the middle. The sonar scans were also interpreted to show the presence of large humps along the monster's back, leading to illustrations of the cryptid as a humpbacked plesiosaur. Additionally, the idea that the creature possessed either horns or breathing tubes atop its head became popular in the 70s, and so lots of reconstructions depict this feature too. However, none of these aspects of anatomy are consistent with what we know about plesiosaurs. The paddles were not diamond-shaped in this way, and did not consist of a single central vein supporting fleshy extensions on either side. Several elongated fingers supported them, and the leading edge would have been stiffened to make them actually effective at underwater propulsion. Plesiosaurs also did not have multi-humped backs, and although there is a species called Umunosaurus that possessed crest ridges on its skull, nothing like the horns or snorkels depicted in the monster is known in the real reptiles either. So this envisioning of Nessiteras would make it an extremely highly derived plesiosaur that must have undergone some dramatic modifications to typical plesiosaur anatomy over the many millions of years this lineage evaded entry into the fossil record, resulting in a very bizarre looking marine reptile. Though it must also be stated that those supposed flipper photos have been heavily manipulated, and most likely just show scrapes in the mud, and the sonar scans are similarly unreliable. But what about other speculative scenarios in which Nessie is not a late surviving plesiosaur? Of course, it's probably just eels, but that's not stopped other people proposing some very creative hypotheses. In contrast to the classic reptilian concept, some have maintained that Nessie is more likely to be a mammal, specifically some sort of undiscovered species of seal. This view was popularized by a book published in 1974, which envisioned Nessie as a long-necked seal, a concept that has been discussed much in the cryptozoological literature as a potential explanation for various other sea serpents. A seal could explain the land-based sightings, and the evolution of such a creature is certainly far more reasonably explained than a late surviving plesiosaur, but I'm not sure how such generally quite loud and obvious animals, which often haul out on land, would have gone unnoticed for so long. A truly wild hypothesis for Nessie's identity was put forth in a book published in 1968, purporting that the cryptid is a living giant descendant of none other than Tully monstrum. This is a bizarre prehistoric animal that lived more than 300 million years ago, often called the Tully monster, possessing eyes on stalks and a proboscis with a jaw-like structure at the end. The precise identity of Tully monstrum has been the subject of much debate, and it's still not entirely resolved as to whether it's closer to vertebrate animals or if it was a member of an invertebrate lineage. I don't think I need to explain how outrageously unlikely it is that this specific, very unusual, and highly specialized lineage of extinct animals somehow survived for over 300 million years, grew to enormous sizes, and is now only found in a lake in Scotland. Eels are a much better explanation anyway. Another idea I particularly love is the one suggested by Trey the Explainer in a video from 2017, in which they hypothesized that Nessie is in fact a giant freshwater leech called Dinohirudo Nessie that feeds on the blood of livestock, and mostly remains small in size except for a few fully grown adults that grow to massive dimensions, explaining why they've been so elusive. Certain fish species have been given as possible explanations for sightings too, such as Jeremy Wade's idea that Nessie is a Greenland shark. Another hypothesis was that the presence of large catfish or sturgeon in the loch might be causing this monstrous commotion. However, that eDNA survey of Loch Ness failed to find any signs of catfish, shark, or sturgeon in the water. There are lots of other speculative scenarios out there too, and browsing the speculative evolution subreddit for Nessie evolution ideas is always fun, but in the end, it's probably just eels. I hope you've enjoyed this tour through the speculative evolution of the Loch Ness Monster, and I hope that the section on real plesiosaur evolution was also useful. The lore surrounding this cryptid is fascinating to me, and although I do not think there's an undiscovered creature inhabiting the loch, the phenomenon of the monster mystery and the dedication many people have shown to searching for Nessie is quite captivating. I really should go back to the loch one day. I've only visited once, but it was fantastic. I'd like to say a huge thank you to the incredibly talented paleoartist Hader Jaffrey for producing this stunning artwork of our speculative Nessiteras rhombopteryx, which was commissioned for this video. Hader is a seriously skilled paleoartist, and his art has even been featured on the front cover of the UK edition of Ancient Sea Reptiles by paleontologist Darren Naish, a book which also proved to be an incredibly useful source for this video. Go follow Hader on Instagram to see more amazing paleoart. His page will be linked down below. I'm also incredibly excited to announce that we now have a revamped and much improved merch store. Thanks to the wonderful people over at Fourth Wall, you can now purchase all these great shirts and other items featuring the Benji Thomas channel logo, and I'm especially excited to bring you this Nessie themed design, with this wonderful illustration of the cryptid and its hypothetical classification scheme, along with a disclaimer that, as we all know, it's probably just eels. I hope you love the design as much as we do. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss our next upload, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.